What if your sensitivities to foods, chemicals, or environmental factors aren't just a symptom of chronic illness, but a key factor in what is keeping your system from healing? And what if resolving those sensitivities could actually help shift your body out of a chronic stress response and into a state where recovery becomes possible? I'm Madeleine Lowry, a neural retraining specialist, and today we're going to talk about a perspective that can be a real turning point for people dealing with chronic illness, chronic fatigue, chronic pain, dysautonomia, immune and nervous system dysregulation, or autoimmune conditions. Because for many people, sensitivities feel like something that you have to manage, or avoid, or work around indefinitely. But what if that is not the whole picture? What if resolving those sensitivities is actually an important part of helping your nervous system and immune system regulate, and ultimately helping your body heal? Let's start by reframing what sensitivities actually are. Whether you react to foods, chemicals, fragrances, environmental irritants, or things like heat or exertion, it is easy to interpret those reactions as a sign that something in your body is being damaged. But in most cases, what we're actually seeing is a nervous system that has become highly sensitized. Your brain, specifically the limbic system, is designed to detect threat and keep you safe. And after repeated experiences of symptoms, it can begin to associate certain inputs with danger. So instead of neutral or safe, those inputs get categorized as a problem that requires a reaction. And that reaction can involve immune activation, inflammation, digestive distress, shortness of breath, tension, pain, or headaches, fatigue, or sleep disturbances. So the sensitivity is real, but it's not necessarily coming from ongoing damage. It is coming from a learned threat response. So let's talk about why avoidance limits healing. Once a sensitivity is established, avoidance becomes the natural response. You avoid the food. You avoid the dust or the fragrance. You avoid the exposure. And initially, that often brings relief. But over time, avoidance can quietly reinforce the pattern. Because every time you avoid something, your brain receives the message, this is really dangerous. And that strengthens the association, creating a negative self-reinforcing cycle. The brain perceives a threat. The body reacts with symptoms. You avoid, restrict, and worry. The brain notices your distress and reinforces the idea that this is truly a threat. And over time, this can lead to increasing sensitivity, generalization to more triggers, and a shrinking range of what feels safe. But there's another layer here that is just as important. When your system is constantly identifying threats, it tends to stay in a sympathetic dominant state, that is, fight, flight, or freeze. And in that state, the immune system becomes dysregulated. Inflammation can persist. Repair and recovery processes are deprioritized. So it's not just that sensitivities are inconvenient. It's that the ongoing reactivity associated with them can actively interfere with healing. Which is why resolving sensitivities is not just about improving your lifestyle. It is about changing the internal environment your body needs in order to heal. And this is where understanding the limbic system becomes central. The limbic system learns through repetition. This is the threat detecting part of your brain. Once it has identified something as a threat, it can generate a response very quickly, often before your conscious mind has any input. Importantly, it does not distinguish between a current objective danger and a learned conditioned association. So if your system has learned that a certain food, chemical, or environmental factor is unsafe, it will produce a real physiological response. And avoidance, while understandable, prevents the brain from ever updating that pattern. Because the only way the brain revises a threat response is through deprogramming the conditioned sensitivity response and reprogramming tolerance, coupled with new experiences of safety. Without the retraining and the safe experiences, the sensitivity remains locked in place. So if resolving sensitivities is part of the healing process, how do you actually do that? This is where many people get stuck, because trying to reintroduce triggers on your own often feels overwhelming and can lead to setbacks. And that makes perfect sense. If your brain still perceives something as dangerous, simply exposing yourself to it can reinforce the reaction rather than resolve it. So the process begins with neural retraining. Neural retraining works directly with the brain's threat detection system to begin changing those learned associations before reintroduction happens. Instead of jumping into the trigger, you take one specific item, one food, one chemical, one environmental exposure, and begin working with it at the level of the brain. Through repeated focus retraining sessions, you are helping your system reduce the perceived threat, build new associations of safety, and shift out of chronic fight or flight. This work is gradual and targeted, and over time people often notice less anticipatory fear, a calmer baseline, and reduced overall reactivity. Only after this groundwork has been established, often through multiple advanced neural retraining sessions focused on one trigger, does reintroduction begin to feel possible. And importantly, it comes from a place where the system is more regulated and more receptive. At that point, reintroduction becomes part of the retraining process, not a test of tolerance. The sequence is what allows the brain to update its response in a way that is safer, more sustainable, and more likely to lead to lasting change. So instead of cycling through avoidance and reactivity, you are creating a new pattern. Retrain, regulate, reintroduce, and expand. And as sensitivities begin to resolve, the nervous system can shift out of that chronic stress state, which creates a physiological environment that is far more supportive of healing. Now, it is important to say here that for people with multiple sensitivities, it is not necessary to retrain the brain for every single thing that you are sensitive to. Often, retraining the brain for a handful of items accomplishes the goal of establishing tolerance in the limbic system, and this becomes generalized to all the things that you are sensitive to. The process is not as daunting as you may expect. In closing, if you've been living with sensitivities, it makes sense that your focus has been on managing them or avoiding them. But what if those sensitivities are also pointing to something deeper? Something that, when addressed, can actually help your system to heal. Resolving sensitivities is not just about expanding what you can tolerate. It is about helping your brain and body shift out of a chronic stress response and into a state where your capacity for healing is optimized. And that is the role neural retraining can play. And that is why this work can be such a powerful piece of the healing process. If you would like to learn more about this work, please visit tcneuralretraining.com. Schedule a free consultation by phone or take our free quiz. And if this episode resonated with you, please follow the podcast, give it a positive rating, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening. Content of this podcast copyright 2026 by Twin Cities Neural Retraining. Music by Barbara Ben.